If you summarize all of these and you have a so-called nice guy with these particular traits here and not these traits here, what you basically end up having is a very affectionate servant. And let's face it, that's not particularly attractive. Nice guys come last. Oh my God, have I ever heard that phrase being used so many times? And for some reason, there's a misconception in the world that nice guys come last, and therefore women only want to date absolute arseholes or total jerks or bad boys. Now, the motive today is to add some more context to what that phrase actually means, what people misunderstand about that phrase, and to explain that actually that's just simply not true. So there's a lot of guys out there that actually, once they're in a relationship, they do nothing but give to their partner. They're sweet, they're attentive, they do them favors, they basically bend over backwards to make their partner happy. But then that often comes with a sense of frustration because they're often not as connected as they'd like to be. They often feel very underappreciated, and more than often, they can end up being dumped or rejected. Now, what that person then sees is that same girl that they've been dating going off and seemingly date some guy who could be seen as an asshole, and it makes absolutely no sense to them. So let me explain on a deeper level what is really happening here. Okay, so a quick disclaimer on a trigger warning. Okay, firstly, I'm not going to wall this up. Some people might get a bit edgy about what I'm about to say, but there's no benefit in my life and there's no benefit in your life if I don't say it exactly as I see it. Now, where I'm coming from is years and years of research, years and years of personal experience, because this is part of my history as well. Then since I've got my own shit sorted, I can talk about it from one extreme to the other. And just one of those common themes that I see in pubs and social situations as well. This topic is massive. Now, there's not enough room in the day to go into this in detail. So hopefully what I'm going to do in this video is to give enough context to break down the bullshit behind that particular phrase and what is really going on. Another thing I want to stress is that this isn't actually gender specific. I'm focusing on men and women, and men being the nice guy just for this video because of the phrase of nice guys come last. But I can assure you this absolutely relates to both sides of the spectrum, whether you're male or female. I'm also very aware that there's multitude of different types of relationships out there, whether it's gay or whether they're bi. That really doesn't really matter because this is a human personality trait. But just for the ease of this particular video, I'm going to put it into talking about heterosexual relationships. So before I get into this in more detail, I recommend, if you haven't done already, to buy the book No More Mr. Nice Guy by Dr. Robert Glover. It was one of the first books that I ever read that was recommended to me by my coach. Now, although the book was written by a man and designed for men, it absolutely talks about psychographic things that has a parallel whether you're male or female. The book gives a lot more detail around what actually happens in these types of behaviors, what's going on unconsciously, and how the behaviors show up. So anybody that actually believes the phrase nice guys come last is somebody that's not really grasp what the bigger picture is. And more than often, those people have a misconception that they have to be intentionally mean in order to be more attractive to a female. That is absolutely not true. So what is a nice guy? Now, some people just happen to refer to themselves as that, and some people actually label themselves in that, almost like a badge of honor. Now, let me be clear. Women want to be with a nice guy. A healthy, confident woman does not want to choose a partner that will actively and intentionally harm her emotionally or physically or spiritually or in any way whatsoever. However, when somebody is a classic nice guy, it's not the aspect of being nice that is the issue. 99.9% of the time, the issue is the fact that the qualities in their personality that they lack. That is what women are put off by. And many of these traits in the world are often known as knowing your strength, masculine traits, being masculine, and sometimes even the phrase of being alpha. Now, let me put some context behind those, because again, they're often very misunderstood, because alpha and masculine and strength does not mean domineering and controlling your woman. If a woman is in a relationship who is confident and healthy within themselves, anybody that tries to control her or dominate her would be absolutely repelling. So it doesn't mean those things. It is purely a reflection how the man shows up within himself within that relationship. Another misconception that I often see is when people think that they're really strong or they're really masculine or they're really alpha because of their particular frame. Now, guys can often bulk up, they can go down to the gym, they can have biceps the size of footballs, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person is masculine or standing in the masculine energy, should I say. Now, with permission with my client, I'm going to tell you a quick example of that. So one of my clients was actually a boxer, and he would get in the ring and he would basically have these fist fights with people obviously in a controlled environment, but he'd have these fist fights with people, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, whatever, but he was always fearless doing it. In his head, that made him masculine, that made him standing in his masculine energy. Now, admittedly, I wouldn't enjoy doing that, but it's still something that he did and prided himself on. He was also a massive adrenaline junkie, and he'd also dive out of planes, and he'd go scrambling down very steep hills in his mountain bike. He did all the boy things, he did all the adrenaline junkie things, and he was built like a brick shithouse, to be quite frank. So yes, you could look at this guy and assume that he was actually quite masculine. However, even though he did all these things that would take a lot of bravery and a lot of physical strength, on one example, even though despite him having this aspect to his personality where he would go into rings and fight people, he was once in his office and he was disrespected, and somebody who's 19 years old, fresh into the office, who was an administrator on the lowest level of that particular business, spoke to him in a disrespectful way. And he didn't know how to hold the boundary. He had no idea how to respond, and he didn't know how to be assertive. So hopefully just from that simple example, you can see the contradiction and the confusion that this guy in his own had in his own head, because in many ways he was acting in this very masculine way. He was doing brave things. He was punching people in the face and being punched in the face. And in many ways, that is an aspect of masculinity. An aspect, I repeat. However, when it came to day-to-day things, he was actually quite a pushover. It was like pushing an open door, and he felt like people would often trample over him. And this very small example of one time this 19-year-old spoke to him out of turn in the office, he didn't know how to handle it. So I was wondering, how am I going to demonstrate this in an easy way? And I actually think it's going to be best if I use my whiteboard, because I'm a lot better at drawing and doodling than I am about talking. So let's go there. Okay, so let's look at some traits versus nice guy traits. Now, very often, a nice guy demonstrates these ones in blue in abundance. Now, more than often when they're demonstrating these, there is a bit of a subtle ulterior motive, which I'm going to touch on a little bit further. However, on paper, very often a nice guy offers things like being very affectionate towards their partner, they're very caring, they're often very kind and very gentle and very empathic, they're very tuned in to what their partner wants and needs, and often showing that in a very strong form of affection. They're generally very, very generous, like they give and they give and they give, and sometimes they give way too much. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit further. And they're often great listeners and very attentive, very switched in to what the partner needs, very willing to listen and be there for them. They're not bad traits to have, right? But obviously, you can have those traits and not be a so-called nice guy as well. Now, this is where it starts falling over a little bit for the nice guy. When it comes to boundaries, often nice guys have very loose boundaries. So more than often, they will allow anything to happen at their own self-compromise. They let go of what's important to them, all often with the motive to please the other person. What the other person wants is more important than what I want, and they often just kind of do anything and don't appear to have any boundaries. When it comes to difficult conversations, now difficult conversations can be quite scary for a nice guy because it can potentially lead to conflict, and conflict often they're very avoidant of. So if a difficult conversation comes along, a nice guy is much more likely to appease and accommodate what the other person wants, as opposed to going into those conversations, or generally just avoids them altogether. When it comes to leading rather than following, often nice guys tend to follow more rather than lead more. And when I talk about lead, I don't mean domination or controlling other people. I just simply mean somebody that's willing to make decisions and stand up for something that is important to them, and sometimes not even that important to them, but just express a preference of what they'd like to do, as opposed to allowing the other person's needs to be the priority. Therefore, they're technically following and compromising on what it is that they would like. So they technically spend more time following than leading. I've written here, doesn't abandon self to please others. Now, a confident guy wouldn't abandon themselves to please other people. And more than often, you can still please other people without abandoning yourself. But more than often, a nice guy is somebody that does actually abandon themselves. They compromise on their own truth. They compromise on something that's important to them. Even if it's a massive inconvenience, they still go ahead and do it because they're much more likely to please the other person. Okay, so here I've written being socially confident. Now, a nice guy is typically socially awkward. Now, this can show up in a number of different ways. Maybe they say something that's a bit inappropriate, or they say something that's a bit awkward socially. And it's likely to be more distorted in situations where they are surrounded by other people who are legitimately alpha or masculine or more confident. And often they feel a need to overcompensate, which might mean that they come out with something that maybe they regret later, or maybe they don't even notice it, but other people might pick up that it was a bit inappropriate. So I've written here emotionally independent, and what I mean by that is that typically nice guys can be quite codependent, which basically means that they're reaching for the other person to fill a void that is missing in them. Codependence is always two ways. That would mean and suggest that the woman indirectly is doing exactly the same thing. However, when somebody is codependent, it means that there's very much an entanglement of stability, that they're leaning on each other rather than being emotionally independent. So self-awareness. Now, typically a nice guy doesn't have a high level of self-awareness, because if they did, they'd stop doing these things. They're often so attached to what the other person wants, what the other person needs, what the other person is thinking, that they've completely lost sight of what's important to them. And therefore that is a bigger picture of why a lot of these are actually manifesting in the way that they are. Okay, so let me add some context to how this shows up in a nice guy's world and why it's so frustrating for them. So I'm going to demonstrate it here with an NG for nice guy, an AS for arsehole, and finally I'm going to abbreviate masculine to mask. Now, what you'll find here is that people who are a nice guy typically have these traits here. So tick, 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 tick. But typically nice guys have a heap of these and mostly lack these. So I'm going to give these a cross. Which brings me on to an arsehole. And often you hear nice guys being frustrated because they've been with a girl, they feel that they've been so nice to them, they've given them everything that they could do, but often they'll leave them and then seemingly end up with an arsehole. But I'll show you what's really going on here. An arsehole can sometimes be these. So I'm going to give them a half. Now, an arsehole is often demonstrating some of these, and if not most of these. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the arsehole is doing it in a confident and a fair and a really lovely way, but they are showing classic signs that they are holding boundaries, that not uncomfortable having difficult conversations. They do often lead. So I'm going to give them a tick for these. And what often happens when you speak to a woman having dated what's seemingly known as an arsehole, they'll often say that they have these experiences with these guys saying, yeah, but when they're nice, they're so nice and they're so sweet to me, and when it's good, it's amazing, and he's so gentle, and he can be this and he can be that, and he can be really generous and he can be really giving, yada yada yada. So what the woman is basically doing is she's admitting and accepting a compromised version of these, because in that process she is getting these, which are actually so important. And this is where the difference of a very, very healthy, confident, masculine, I say alpha loosely because there are different definitions of the word alpha. I simply mean it from a place of high confidence, willing to lead, and very fair person. You can still have all of these, but you have these as well. So it looks like this. And that, my friends, is why women prefer a healthy masculine guy to a nice guy. Now, I would be very confident to say that if you ask any well-adjusted, confident woman on this planet, and you said you have two options of the guys that you can date. You can have a guy with all of these and a limited amount of these, or you can have a guy with all of them full stop. A healthy, well-adjusted, confident woman, I would put my last dime to my life that they will always choose a person with all of these, not just these here. And this is why it's not really about what the nice guys have, it's what they don't have that is actually losing them their catch. Now, I'm very aware in this video I've talked a lot around the nice guy and the woman. It's just because it's a typical phrase, but it actually isn't gender specific. It can be flipped, I'm aware of that. So if you ask a very, very confident man, and you ask him what he's looking for in a woman, he will want all of these as well, but he will also want a woman who is boundary-based, a woman that is willing to have difficult, fearless conversations, a woman that is willing to lead as well as follow. He doesn't want to carry somebody all the time. He wants somebody that can make decisions and stand up for themselves. He doesn't want a woman who's just going to completely abandon herself and compromise and everything to please him. That is what confident people find and attractive in other people. So this isn't gender specific, but I'm just using the terminology of the nice guy in order to demonstrate this video. I will also add that I'm very, very aware that there's lots of relationships out there where the phrase is women wear the trousers. And I actually work with a lot of those women too. Now, at the same time, whilst those women are wearing the trousers, typically what they've ended up in is a codependent relationship, which makes it very difficult to separate because there's a lot of dependency on the other person to feel their own self-worth. However, I can assure you these women still get very frustrated at the fact that they're dating guys or married to guys that aren't stepping into the power, not leading enough, not making enough decisions, not coming across as assertive enough, and they're still finding it very frustrating even though they're still in that relationship with them. If you summarize all of these and you have a so-called nice guy with these particular traits here and not these traits here, what you basically end up having is a very affectionate servant. And let's face it, that's not particularly attractive. And I'll go even one step further, that if you meet a guy that is very, very confident and sure of himself and has all of these and has those as well, basically this list, that is sexy. There's no two ways about it, it's sexy. And I'll tell you even on a further deeper level why a nice guy, the psyche behind why it isn't sexy, because explain to me why having those and not these is any much different from a parent-child relationship. This goes without saying, if you look at a parent-child relationship where there's a lot of affection, there's a lot of love, there's lots of care, lots of giving, and it's going both ways as well. However, when it comes to a parent-child, it's more likely that the parent will be the one holding the boundaries rather than the child. It's more likely that the parent will be holding the difficult conversations and the child is much more likely to be conflict avoidant and avoiding those difficult conversations. The parent is much more likely to lead rather than follow, whereas the child is much more likely to follow rather than lead. And I can go through all of these, but just as a final example, a child is much more likely to abandon themselves to please the parent than the other way around. So this is why, let's cut to the chase, that is not sexy, and it doesn't take a rocket science to see why that's not sexy. And this is why typically those relationships, long term, one of the first things that falls by the wayside is the intimacy in such relationships, because it does end up having a bit of a dynamic of parent and child. Okay, so let's add a final twist to this and some more meat on the bone still. Ta-da! Okay, cool. So basically, imagine this as a spectrum of boundaries. So I'll put that in there. Okay, this is a boundary spectrum. Now, when a nice guy has loose boundaries, I've color coordinated this to kind of demonstrate what actually happens. I don't have an amber pen, so I've had to use blue. But people that have very high self-worth and high self-confidence have a very clear mind around what a high boundary might look like or what a low boundary look like, low being loose, obviously. Now, when somebody is a nice guy, it doesn't mean they have absolutely zero. And to be honest, in any situation, it does depend on the circumstances. Let me give you a bit of a basic rule of thumb there. If you're in a pub, for example, and somebody, I don't know, say a woman's in a pub and a guy comes up to the woman and grabs her bum, and it's a complete stranger, the chances are it's going to be deemed as pretty inappropriate. Whereas if that person was their husband, then that's not going to be inappropriate. It's the same behaviour, completely different circumstance, completely different boundary level, and therefore it's completely okay for a husband to do that, normally, but it wouldn't be okay for a stranger to do that. So it's not just cut and dry that this behaviour means it's a boundary. It does depend on the circumstances. However, a nice guy typically spends their time milling around in the loose and low level of boundaries. Now, more than often when they do express a boundary, what happens is it's normally when it's something extreme. So it might be when they've actually finally got into conflict and they feel that they're able to say something that, because they've almost been pushed into a corner to speak up. It could also be when, it could be a really obvious one, like the example I've just given around grabbing somebody's bum. That might be very clear in their mind that that's not okay. So maybe that might be something when a nice guy would actually say something and hold a boundary. Doesn't mean it's a guarantee. Some extreme nice guys wouldn't actually do that. But nonetheless, it's still something that would be very apparent. It's actually the stuff that is outside conflict that it demonstrates all of this side of it as well. So when a guy has loose boundaries, something will happen and they'll be down here somewhere. Now here's the twist of what happens. When somebody has a loose boundary when actually it should have maybe been up here, it adds on to their suppression of the pressure pot, as I call it. So they're suppressing something that they feel about themselves. They're suppressing maybe their own truth. They're compromising on what's actually important to them. And they're basically limiting their own integrity. This creates a little bit of added something into here. So they have a little bit added onto there. And what also is interesting, more than often, it can actually create what I call marks on the board, like they now have a bit of an IOU hanging over the other person. Now, Dr. Robert Glover refers to this as a secret contract or a covert contract. And what he means by that is that every time a guy who's acting like a nice guy is compromising on themselves, there is a little bit, sometimes like a lot, a level of manipulation, because it's I'm giving you this and therefore I want something in return. So over time, lots of things happen and they just keep remaining in the lower end of the boundary. So this starts up here and then more will happen. And then they have marks on the board. Meanwhile, this is getting more and more heavy and filled up because they're constantly doing things where they're compromising on themselves and they're basically limiting what it is that's important to them. Now, this can be things that actually is just an expression, and you can feel that person's confidence and you can feel that person's boundaries. It doesn't have to be, I will say something if this person grabs my arse. Maybe it's, do you know what, it's about time, I'm not doing it again. I did it for the last 2 times. It's your turn to go and do it. It's just simply expressing something. And often when you're with somebody and a nice guy is with somebody that will manipulate the fact that this person has very loose boundaries, they will ask of their partner to do lots of things for them. You know, maybe it's to do with finances, maybe it's to do with lifts, maybe it's to do with favors, maybe it's just a general emotional imbalance when all the emotional care is on the woman rather than the man, and the man is more ignored or his feelings are less important. If a manipulative woman gets hands on a nice guy, they're in for a very, very bumpy ride. However, that's not appealing for a very confident woman. So not only is then a woman almost asking for these favors off the guy, even though on a deeper level they kind of want them to be more assertive, but similarly they also know that they're getting a lot of things from this person, it can actually start leading into a toxic relationship. But additionally, what also happens with nice guys, it isn't just what is asked of them, it's what they offer. Now, conversations can look like something, I'm just going to make this one up. I'm going out tonight, love, so I'll be back later. All right, darling, well, I'll come and pick you up when you're ready. No, it's okay. You normally like to have a drink on a Friday night. No, it's okay. I won't have a drink tonight. But I don't know what time I'm going to be finished. I might not be finished till 11 or 12. Okay, well, I'll just wait up until 11 or 12. But what happens if I want to go to the club? Well, okay, I'll wait up till 2 or 3 and I'll still come and pick you up. But I thought you've agreed to meet your family tomorrow. Oh, it's okay. I'll cancel my family and I'll come and pick you up. It's this constant accommodation, this constant agreeability, this constant I'm trying to please, this constant give. But over time, unconsciously, sometimes and sometimes very consciously, that resentment from almost having somebody that just gives and taking can actually build up to something that becomes very uncomfortable for the nice guy. So not only is there a pile of things up here, of marks on the board of, I did this for you, now you owe me, I did this for you, now you owe me, this starts building up as well. And before you know it, this hits the absolute brimming point when that person can then explode. And this can lead into something that can either be just an unexpected massive bust up, or it can also include things of passive aggression, or it can be slamming doors. It doesn't necessarily mean open dialogue, uncomfortable communication that can actually resolve something. It can just lead to this huge level of resentment because all this suppression has been happening. Now, this can also lead to marks on the board. Now, what do I mean by that? That very often when a nice guy is constantly pleasing, there is a very, very secret IOU. And this can be a number of different things. It can be, and again, that person doesn't walk around thinking it as consciously as this, but they'll often feel it when they're not getting something that maybe secretly they desired or they kind of expected, like an expectation, because I've given you all of this, now you owe me. And that can be maybe it can be a sexual encounter, maybe it's more sex or readily giving the sex when they want it, maybe it's how can you ever leave me because I've given you all this stuff. Maybe it's just this expectation of this commitment heavily into the relationship. And this is why it can be so confusing for a nice guy, because in this world, all they've done is suppress what is their own truth, suppress what is important to them, and accommodate the other person on this world of giving, giving, giving. Meanwhile, racking up a covert contract of, now you owe me this because all I've done is give you this and you haven't given me anywhere near as much back. And then what ends up happening is you end up in either a very toxic relationship, or it just doesn't work and it ends up falling apart anyway. And the reason why this is so attractive to a healthy, confident, sure of themselves woman, because if a person can show boundaries in this scale as well, even the simple things that other times might not be seen as a big deal, but you see them on almost in a subtle way on a day-to-day basis, when we're not talking about an extreme case of having your ass grabbed or somebody, you know, speaking to you out of order, or maybe an actual conflict. It's these boundaries that really show up as somebody that, when you know that they're there, you categorically know that they're going to be showing these, because these are actually harder in many ways to actually live by, because often it can be seen as maybe the person isn't being nice enough if they don't demonstrate these boundaries here. If you're only waiting for something to be bad or conflict or a high level of disrespect towards your partner before you express a boundary, then you're missing out on all of this that she doesn't see, and therefore she won't know that you're safe in those situations. And as a final twist to this, when we live in a world where we're constantly giving, giving, giving to the other person, do not underestimate how much is actually a secret debt. It's not really about giving, it's actually about taking. On paper, it looks like we're giving, but at the same time, when that person is actually giving and they have the motive to, now you owe me, what they're really doing is taking. They're taking that person's approval, they're taking that person's commitment, they're taking that person's secret covert contract in order to get more sex or to get more affection or to get their commitment that they won't leave them in any way. So it looks always like the person is giving, 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 but secretly what they're really chasing is to actually take. And that comes from a very fragile place of confidence and a very fragile level of self-esteem, because a confident guy wouldn't do that to himself. And as a last point, I really, really, really want to stress about this, because it's very often misunderstood, is that when somebody is being nice to their partner, or they're compromising, or they're accommodating them, and they do it once or twice, that does not make them a traditional nice guy. It doesn't mean that they lack boundaries. What I'm describing here is a pattern. I'm not talking about one-offs. I don't want somebody to listen to this and go, yeah, but I've picked my girlfriend up at 4 a.m. and that doesn't make me with no boundaries. Maybe so, but if you're doing it every week and every other day-to-day eventuality when they'd like to see a boundary you're not expressing, it probably actually does mean that you fall into that category. But don't take a single example and think, oh, and get defensive about it, thinking, oh, that isn't me and that isn't fair. This is a pattern. I'm talking about when this goes on for a longevity, or when somebody, particularly at the beginning of relationships, really, really just fall over backwards. It's like pushing an open door to make that person like them more. This is a pattern of a lifestyle. We're not talking about one-offs here and there. But I will add, unless you recognize this, if this is resonating with you, and unless you recognize this and identify and make your changes to it, you will just keep attracting the same types of experiences, the same types of people, and the same types of relationships time and time again. Okay, so what have we learned from that? Well, I can tell you my top tip. Unless you're willing to look at this and make it a change as part of your life, and if you don't build your own confidence and don't build your own worth and start understanding what those boundaries look like on a day in, day out situation, this relationship pattern will go on loop time and time and time again. So it is possible you don't resonate with this whatsoever, and you're just a really confident guy, and this isn't something that plagues your life. Now, if that is the case, the chances of you watching this far into the video is unlikely, because you probably would have lost interest ages ago. You also might be watching this and it's really resonating with you, and there's been some light bulb moments or some aha moments. Now, if that's the case, then I urge you to start taking action on this, because understanding it is not enough. We have to be it. We have to live it. Now, understanding it is absolutely essential, but it's not the destination. Understanding it is literally the starting blocks to start making the changes that are going to make a difference in your life. Now, some people are actually in massive denial about this being part of their life. So if that's the case, I'm going to ask some quick questions. And if you answer yes to one or two of them, there's a good chance this is something that you might need to look at as well. Do you often get the sense that you give more than you take? Do you also get frustrated and tired that you seem to be giving so much to other people, and often at the inconvenience to yourself? Do you actually do many things that you just secretly wish you weren't doing, but you want to make somebody else happy? Okay, so here's a big one. When you look back at your relationships and your exes, particularly the long-term ones, do you often think of them as toxic, manipulative, and controlling? Do you pride yourself almost like a badge of honor that you're really laid back, Mr. Chilled out, and barely anything upsets you or frustrates you? Do you often find that you've got a history of attracting women that often have a story around how many assholes they've dated and how badly they've been treated by men? Do you secretly want to be the person to prove to them that men can be nice, almost like you need to save this woman? And finally, another big one. Do you find women utterly confusing? Because once you're in a relationship with them, you seem to give your all, and you give and you give and you give. And often these people still end the relationship. So if you watched the video this far and you found that all of this has been interesting, but it isn't something you personally connect with, but you did happen to answer yes to one or two of those questions, then I urge you to start exploring making that change for yourself, because I cannot express it enough that once you've got your own self-worth and your own confidence sorted out, then this is going to be an absolute game changer for you. And finally, something that I think is really important. If this is something that you have connected with, and maybe you have had some highlighted moments in your life from this video, then I can't stress enough, this doesn't make you a bad person. In fact, I admire your ability to be that self-reflective and that vulnerable in a way to recognize something about yourself that you would benefit from changing. Yes, I have described some behaviors that might be considered quite manipulative, but more than often, people that are nice guys or people pleasers, they don't come from a place that they're trying to actively be malicious to other people or be mean to other people. In the heat of the moment, they actually believe that what they're doing is coming from a place of kindness or coming from a place of good, but not realizing that that behavior is actually the thing that's pushing people away and damaging their own confidence. And in fact, that damaging their own confidence actually fuels more behaviors. And in fact, that's why it becomes more repelling to a confident woman. So let me just make that very clear, that this doesn't make you a bad person if you've connected with it, but it's definitely worth recognizing how this is affecting yourself and your own self-worth. As always, if you found this video useful, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell for all future content. And other than that, have a good day. Cheers.